From Springfield, this is State Week, a program of analysis and commentary on the events that made news this past week in Illinois state government and politics.
Thank you, Chicago. A few moments ago, I spoke with Tony Preckwinkle. In this election, Tony and I were competitors, but our differences are nothing compared to what we can achieve together.
After this hard-fought campaign, this may not be the outcome we wanted, but while I may be disappointed, I'm not disheartened. For one thing, this is clearly an historic night. Not long ago, two African-American women vying for this position would have been unthinkable.
Together, we can and will finally put the interests of our people, all of our people, ahead of the interests of a powerful few. And that means we can and we will make our streets, all of our streets, safe again. We can and we will give our neighborhoods, all of our neighborhoods, the same time and attention that we give the downtown.
Well, the Chicago mayor's race is over. It wasn't close. Lori Lightfoot defeating Tony Preckwinkle. That means Chicago will have its first African-American woman and first openly gay mayor. And we'll be talking more about that coming up on this State Week. I'm Sean Crawford in Springfield. Joining me in studio, Charlie Wheeler, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield, and a longtime State House reporter and observer. And also joining us from the State House is the IPR State House editor, Brian Mackey. And by phone today, we welcome a new guest, Jamie Nesbitt Golden. She's with the news site Block Club. It's an online news organization that focuses on Chicago neighborhoods. And Jamie, it's good to have you on. Welcome to State Week.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I mentioned earlier what we know, a lot of folks downstate especially know about Lori Lightfoot, African-American woman, openly gay mayor, about to take over. But let me ask you, what else about her do we not know? What's maybe some of the things that people should know about her?
Well, she started at Meyer Brown defending corporations from racial discrimination cases before becoming a federal prosecutor. She worked on Operation Silver Shovel, which was this big city corruption case in the 90s that led to the indictment of like a half dozen aldermen. She has a really big reputation for siding with law and order, and she's not really a favorite of like local activists who believe that she mishandled the Rekia Boy case. So she was also appointed to Rahm Emanuel's Special Police Task Force and resigned a little shortly before, throwing her hat in the ring for mayor. So she has this reputation for not being really friendly to, activists who are looking for more progressive leadership.
Charlie, does this election signal a change in the city of Chicago, or has that change been occurring and it's just now showing up a bit more?
Well, I think I would agree with what Tony Preckwinkle said at the opening. When I started as a reporter, the notion that someday Chicago would have a black mayor was unthinkable. A woman mayor was also unthinkable. And yet in 1979, Jane Byrne became the first woman to be mayor of Chicago. 1983, Harold Washington became the first black person. And now we have Lori Lightfoot. We also have, in the other two high offices, we have women of color. Melissa Conyer-Irwin was elected as city treasurer. Anna Valencia is the city clerk. We also have the Cook County State's Attorney, Kim Fox, who is a black woman. And Toni Preckwinkle herself is head of the Cook County Democratic Party. So as I say, when I started as a reporter, the notion that you would even have one woman or one person of color in positions like that was unthinkable. Back then it would be considered kind of groundbreaking if you had somebody who wasn't Irish in one of those positions.
And Brian, this was a big win, as I mentioned. This wasn't even close, and amazing of just how widespread across the city it was.
Yeah, normally we would sort of break down which areas of the city somebody won in, but it's a pretty easy question this time around because Lori Lightfoot won all 50 wards. I think there were a few precincts in Toni Preckwinkle's sort of home neighborhood area, her sort of political base of support where she did well, but citywide it was really a huge win for Lori Lightfoot. I saw WBEZ had a breakdown of the numbers. They said the last Chicago mayoral candidate who captured more than 70% of the vote was Richard M. Daley, and he didn't win even with that family name. It took him several election cycles to sort of build up to that margin of victory.
So, Jamie, how did Lori Lightfoot pull this off as far as gaining such wide support across the city of Chicago?
Well, I think that the backing of the machine really helped. I think her history with defending big business definitely worked in her favor. I think the fact that Preckwinkle really didn't, she really had trouble finding her way, in that she couldn't connect or engage with voters. She didn't really do anything but offer herself as the person who wasn't Lori Lightfoot, and I think that harmed more than helped. But with Lori, she had the backing of the unions, like the firefighters, the plumbers, letter carriers, Teamsters. She had the support of organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, the Latino Leadership Council, even Gloria Steinem, who is not a resident of Illinois, tossed her support her way. I think that Lightfoot was a candidate that people could really see as a progressive one.
You mentioned the machine, and I hear that a lot from people, and yet I also hear a lot of folks say that the Chicago machine is dead. It no longer exists. It probably does exist, at least in some form. What are we talking about when we say that these days?
I think we're talking about the specter of the politics of the 70s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Remnants of Daley's reign, remnants of even Harold Washington's reign to some extent. I think that the machine never really dies. And I think that was very apparent in this particular election. Lightfoot still has, even though she fashions herself as an outsider, she was very much an insider, given her, prior history as a federal prosecutor, given her ties to Rahm Emanuel, who himself was kind of part of the machine. I think the death knells are kind of premature in this case.
And Jamie, can I ask, I want to sort of drill down on something you said. You talked about the sort of work that Lightfoot had done as an attorney. And I think if you listen to her victory speech, you would think she was a progressive in the mold of Bernie Sanders and just going to do all these great things, from a left perspective. Do you see a disconnect, or do the activists that you talk to in your reporting see a disconnect between how she portrayed herself?
There is definitely a disconnect. There have been reports of Lightfoot sort of throwing activists out of meetings, being confrontational, being standoffish, being inaccessible. The math isn't quite math here when it comes to her sort of presenting herself as an outsider, as a reformist, especially when she hasn't done anything to really curry favor with these grassroots organizations that are looking again for more progressive leadership when it comes to handling CPS closures, when it comes to police reform. It doesn't, I think it rang false for a lot of folks who have sort of crossed swords with her.
Charlie, I want to get back to the discussion, what we were mentioning there about the machine. It's a lot different today, I guess, than what I think, perceive it to be, certainly from the first Mayor Daley regime. Things, times of that, going back to those times, it's certainly a lot different now.
Yeah, it doesn't have the same ability to influence elections, particularly in Cook County and once upon a time statewide, that it did, again, when I started as a reporter. And probably the major factor has been the litigation and the court rulings that basically have made it much more difficult to do patronage. It used to be back in the day that you could be on the city payroll or on the county payroll, and your major responsibility was to deliver your precinct for the Democratic ticket. And the deal in the neighborhoods was, we'll take care, you call the committeeman, and we'll fix the potholes in your street. We'll make sure your garbage is picked up. We'll make sure the trees are trimmed. And all we ask of you is that you vote the way we want you to twice in even-numbered years, in the primary and in the general. And you vote for the Democratic ticket. Back then, in general elections, there was a box you could mark where you would vote for all the Democrats. And the story used to be that the precinct captains would stand outside, and if somebody was in the voting booth too long, that would indicate that that person was maybe not just punching the Democratic number, but they were kind of wandering all over. Well, that changed with a number of rulings. There's a number of cases that came out of Cook County that led to something called the Shackman Decree, which said you couldn't hire people based on political preferences. Then on the state level, there's a Rutan decision in, I want to say, the late 80s that said that you cannot promote people or fire them based on political leanings. So that took away the kind of jobs that you could reward the party faithful with for doing your wishes. And since then, I think the demographic changes in the city of Chicago have erased a lot of the power that the old white, basically white, or African Americans who, despite their pigmentation, voted just like white politicians, even against their community's interests. That's kind of changed as well. The machine still isn't totally dead. Obviously, you look at Alderman Burke, Ed Burke, who, despite being under federal charges, won in the primary with more than 50% of the vote, so he didn't even go to a runoff.
Brian, let me ask you this about Lori Lightfoot, because I think it's an interesting angle, is that she doesn't have that political background that, for the most part, mayors of Chicago traditionally have had. Maybe some of them have served here in Springfield at the State House or in some other capacities. She doesn't quite have that connection that maybe some of the others did.
Well, I think that an operative I was talking to a few years ago sort of summed this up for me in a way that sort of made all of our recent elections make sense, both Illinois and nationally, is that the key distinction that voters are looking for nowadays is insider-outsider. And so despite what the reality is, and as Jamie said, Lightfoot maybe portrayed herself as more of an outsider than she really was if you look at her background, but if you can convince voters that you are the outsider candidate and not the one who is the insider, that wins. And we saw Preckwinkle was able to successfully do that against Todd Stroger back in, 2010, I think, when she first won the Cook County Board presidency. We saw Bruce Rauner do that as governor in 2014. We saw J.B. Pritzker do that. We are now in an era of political neophytes, or at least people who have not held elected positions, thinking that they can sort of leapfrog the usual climb your way up, starting maybe on the school board, work your way, if it's elected, start on the school board, work your way up to the city council, and then maybe the state legislature, Congress, kind of work your way up that political ladder. If you have enough money, or you can, build enough of a brand around yourself, then people can sort of leapfrog into these top executive positions. And the mayor of Chicago is certainly one of the biggest political jobs in the country.
And Toni Preckwinkle did have this political experience, and Jamie, you did profile her. That long career in politics an asset, or was it a liability in this race?
I think it was very much liability. I think that the specter of the soda tax really harmed her chances. Also, years ago, I covered her for the Hyde Park Herald, which is a neighborhood newspaper here, and I was also a resident of the ward where she was alderman. And a lot of the complaints I heard were from folks who thought that she was too inaccessible when it came to trying to get basic city services to their neighborhoods. And we never really saw her out and about or engaging, with residents. I never saw her speak to anybody under the age of 30. And also, folks have long memories, and those memories sort of include the fact that, while she championed affordable housing or her affordable housing record, she kind of looked the other way when University of Chicago sort of expanded its housing and commercial developments. She just, a number of residents have been displaced because they can't afford to live in this neighborhood. And I think those things sort of really worked against her as well.
So Lori Lightfoot hasn't taken over yet, but these challenges are now hers, the ones that the city faces. What are some of the key challenges that will land in her lap on day one?
Well, definitely the budgetary issue, the fact that the city is $32 billion in debt, and we have to figure out a way to sort of dig out of that hole. She's going to have a big CPD problem in that folks do not trust the current superintendent, and we have paid roughly $113 million in police misconduct lawsuits in the last several years. She's going to have to figure out a way to rebuild trust in these communities that feel that they've been over-policed, and sort of be careful not to run afoul of groups like the FOP or regular police department officers. So she's going to have to sort of figure out that balance. She's also got an issue with the schools. We've shuttered dozens and dozens of schools in the last decade. We're suffering a huge population drop when it comes to African American residents. She's going to have to figure out a way to stop that from happening. She's going to have to, again, it's really about giving people a reason to stay and giving people a reason to believe in her and her platform. And she's just really going to have to build that goodwill up somehow.
We talk about state government on this show every week, and Charlie and Brian, we often talk about what a tough job it is to be governor of the state of Illinois, the challenges that go into that. I actually think they may be worse for the mayor of Chicago. There's a lot of challenges that are really going to be difficult to overcome, I would think. And Charlie, we can start with you on that. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's probably true, although, as I've said before, the most difficult job in government, in my mind, is being director of the Department of Children and Family Services. But yeah, the governor has more tools at his disposal, and he's got a broader canvas on which to play. And one of the things that I wonder about Lori Lightfoot is she won remarkably large percentage of the vote of those who chose to vote. But if I'm not mistaken, most Chicagoans didn't bother to vote. And so the question is, how does she motivate those people to become more civically engaged? How does she deal with the expectations of the business community and the developers versus the hopes of the neighborhoods that don't necessarily want to be gentrified and be forced out of what had been their comfortable middle-class neighborhood to have it replaced by millennials and high-rises? And that's been ongoing in the city, and it's been a big problem. And I think part of her challenge will be dealing with these expectations, varying expectations from the community. Plus, you have this vast gulf between the residents of the South Side and the West Side and the police department. How do you bridge that gap? How do you get the community to a greater extent to be behind the police force? There's all these, the violence, the shootings, the killings. I would guess, and it's totally uneducated guess, but I would suspect that folks in the neighborhood know who's responsible. They just don't trust the police to go to them and say, hey, Wheeler's the guy who pulled the trigger.
Mm-hmm. Brian, your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think everything everyone has said is right. It is a difficult job because you're the governor of the state of Illinois. People don't expect you to have that sort of granular connection with the everyday happenings in the state, I think. Whereas when you're the mayor of Chicago and there's a tragedy in a neighborhood or something like that, you're pretty much expected to show up, know the right things to say, and a lot of that is now on your plate. It's you are viewed as having the responsibility for that, and like Jamie said, it's a particularly challenging job where you have both a citizenry that feels outraged about the police and a police department that feels outraged about the way, in their view, they feel wrongly portrayed by the media and sort of put upon. And so it's a really difficult, challenging thing to try and to figure out. And it's going to be interesting to watch, certainly. And I also think it's interesting, just from our perspective here in Springfield, where we look at state government, when Lightfoot was at a unity event at the Rainbow Push headquarters the day after the election with Tony Preckwinkle. Jesse Jackson was there. She talked about some of her legislative priorities, or sort of policy priorities, and all three of them, I was struck by this fact, go through Springfield, right? An elected and representative school board, ending cash bond, and a graduated income tax. And so for somebody who doesn't necessarily have that sort of long track record in elected office, despite her connections with political people, it's going to be interesting to see her have to sort of build up that support in the General Assembly as time is ticking down on the spring legislative session. I think she'll formally take office in May. The session is scheduled to end May 31st. It's not a lot of time to get an agenda through.
And I think I read, Brian, and correct me if I'm wrong, that she might be making an appearance at the Capitol, the State House, as early as next week, and may start to try to build some of those coalitions.
Yeah, well, like I said, time is running out. So, I think I read that as well, and we'll see as she starts to go to work.
Well, the thing to remember is if she doesn't make it next week, she's going to have to wait 2 weeks because the legislature's taking off for the Easter Passover break.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, she's not going to have to do this job alone, though, because she does have a city council. Can you give us sort of an overview of what kind of council she'll be working with? Is that changing a lot, or do we know yet?
Well, I think that she's going to be dealing with a more progressive city council this time around. The fact that we're looking at a half dozen aldermen who were tied to the DSA, the Democratic Socialists. I think that that's significant in that she's not going to have, I think we're used to having a rubber stamp council, and that's not going to happen this time around. And certain candidates have made it very clear that they are not going to be pushed around, that, they are standing very firm in what they expect from the mayor-elect, and she has to, she'll be held, accountable if she doesn't come through.
And before we leave the mayor's race itself, but Tony Preckwinkle, who we said, of course, lost, what's next for her? What does the future look like for her?
Well, she said that she's not running for another public office after this. So I think she, finishes out her term as county board president, and she kind of takes a step back after. She leaves the post, I think, in 2022. So after that, I think, she just, becomes like, she goes back to her family, she hangs out with the grandkids, and that's that.
Well, she has some political ties as well, though, being that the county chairwoman there, does she, party chairwoman, does she stay in that, do we think, or is she going to hold on to that position?
I think she holds on to that position as well, like for the time being. I think she licks her wounds, she, and she just prepares, to leave in the next couple of years. With this loss, I think Preckwinkle is more than willing to sort of step away and, live her life.
Brian, before we end, I wanted to touch back on something you brought up a moment ago, and that was this idea of an elected Chicago Public School Board. As you mentioned, this would take legislation, and it has been proposed. That also came up during the mayor's race. Kind of fill us in on what's going on behind the scenes there.
Yeah, it did come up in the mayor's race, and Lightfoot indicated she supported the idea, but 2 days after her election, the Illinois House pushed a bill through that actually would change the school board from being appointed by the mayor to one that is elected by voters. And it turns out, after the fact, WBEZ, our sister public radio station in Chicago, went back to an interview they had done with Lightfoot and found some tape where she said that particular proposal was a, quote, recipe for disaster and chaos. This one would have called, the bill that passed through the House would have called for a 20-member board plus a board president, which Lightfoot says would be too big. It would be unwieldy. And she also worried about how expensive campaigns for an elected school board would be. And said, maybe, perhaps you could have a requirement that people would have to have some experience on a local school council. So this is something that is still going to be developing. Senate President John Cullerton has long been sort of protested and hounded by people who want an elected school board, but he has sort of kept a brick on that from happening in the past. It'll be so I don't think that just because this legislation passed the House that it's going to land on the governor's desk anytime soon. But this is going to be an issue to watch in the coming months.
Yeah, and I think an interesting thing would be if, in fact, the Senate, President Cullerton decides, okay, this is what the new mayor wants, and so we'll go along with it. But the Senate changes it to reflect the kind of smaller board that Lori Lightfoot wants. That would be, I guess, kind of a gift to the mayor, if you will. So sure. That's what I'd be looking for, because it passed the House overwhelmingly. I think the vote was, 110-2, something like that?
So And I just a sort of a footnote, the legislator who sponsored that, the recipe for disaster school board bill, as Lightfoot characterized it, was a representative named Robert Martwick from Chicago. He crashed a Lightfoot news conference before the primary, had this face-to-face confrontation with her that went viral. And sort of, I guess, bolstered her reputation for toughness, is what the pundits have said. It was enough that she later took to Twitter to sort of mockingly wish him a happy birthday and thank him for giving her that moment that helped her campaign.
Every campaign needs a viral moment. So let's go to our notes from the field, and Jamie, we'll start with you.
So normally I'm a pessimist when it comes to politics, but while covering election night results, I was at the victory party of one of the aldermen who was running for the 20th ward, Jeanette Taylor, who seems to be like this really dynamic grassroots community organizer. She is known for leading one of the hunger strikes to save a local school here years ago. And she won over another Black woman, Nicole Johnson, who's amazing in her own right. What really struck me about this victory party, it was the level of enthusiasm and excitement that I hadn't really seen since the days of Barack Obama when he won the Senate race. I think Jeanette Taylor is definitely going to be somebody to watch in the years ahead. She is definitely one of the more progressive ones. She's one of the 6 aldermen that will be joining city council that has the DSA ties, the DSA connection. So she'll definitely be somebody to watch in the years ahead. And I think it was really great watching people get excited over a politician again.
Okay, that's all the time we have for this edition of State Week. Our panel included Charlie Wheeler, Brian Mackey, and Jamie Nesbitt-Golden with the Block Club Chicago. You can get a podcast of our show at nprillinois.org or go to the NPR One app. Production assistance for the program provided by Bob Meyer. I'm Sean Crawford.
You've been listening to State Week, a program of commentary and analysis of events in Illinois state politics and government. State Week is produced in the state capital by public radio station NPR Illinois. This is IPR, Illinois Public Radio.